So we're on Gimel Amud Beis 3b. But before we go forward, I want to make comments on the previous Gemara. So the previous Gemara, we talked about the one mitzvah that leads the person, that accompanies a person in heaven and announces his arrival, and then the sin that wraps around him, taking him into negativity. We talked about that. And before that, we talked about the sesame seed rotting on the inside, caused by promiscuity and anger. So on our YouTube channel, there's two comments here that I want to share with you. That someone left here. Of course, first of all, I'm very grateful when I get comments on the Gemara during the day, both in email or online. Rabbi Gimple has sent me some emails with his kind of recap on some of the more difficult Gemaras, and I encourage you to reach out to him to get that. So one person commented on an interesting point on the sesame seed, is that you would first notice the rot from the taste before you would from the sight, which is interesting. I have to think about exactly what that would mean. I don't know the science of rotting sesame seed, but that would seem something interesting, as in like there's
maybe some rancidity.
Sorry?
Maybe some rancidity involved there.
Yeah, meaning it's not as readily apparent the damage you're doing, but when you get into it, you start to really see the damage. It's perhaps it's an interesting point. And someone else wrote something which is very beautiful. I want to read it for you. So the person wrote like this: maybe one mitzvah equals one truth. Right? We're talking about why it says one mitzvah. A person does one mitzvah. This mitzvah is announced before him as he enters into heaven. And we're talking about why one mitzvah, as opposed to many mitzvahs or whatever it is. So the person commented, I think it's very nice. One mitzvah meaning one truth, meaning not about how many mitzvahs you do, but that the idea is one. And he continues, and truth always walks ahead of you. It is a better representation of oneself than one's face and voice. That's why it describes the mitzvah as announcing in front of you as you go into heaven, because like your truth or your engagement in truth is larger than you yourself, as it were. And therefore one avera, right, and conversely it says one sin, is one lie. And a lie is the famous snake. And thus the analogy, and thus the snake, right, which wraps around the person. So there's like the interesting change. When it comes to the mitzvah, it announces in front of you, whereas the sin wraps around you. And he's kind of commenting, I like it, that the mitzvah, the truth, is that which is the best version of you. So it kind of precedes you to announce your arrival, whereas sin is what traps you. So it wraps around you, as opposed to announcing your arrival. It's an interesting point there. All right. And he kind of talks about how, in that sense, using the analogy we use about seeing the truth in the world to come, he was saying if you live in accordance with that truth here, then you've kind of created heaven already here. And if you're living in this lie, in the sin mode, then you've created a hell even here, even before you've got there, which is a very interesting point. And then finally, I wanted to comment something I wanted to mention last time, which I forgot actually, is the connection between promiscuity and anger. Right? Those are the two things we describe that destroys the home from the inside, because like the worms in sesame seed. So what's the connection between promiscuity and lie? And anger. Promiscuity and anger. So in a person's personal, in the home, in the literal sense of the Gemara, I'm sure there's a connection there, which is not what I want to comment on. I want to comment on the relationship between us and Hashem. Right? We are the wife, Hashem is the husband, and therefore this whole Sotah is like an analogy for our relationship with Hashem, in that we are warned not to be unfaithful through sin. So I just want to make a comment on the connection there between promiscuity and anger. So in the analogy, in our relationship with us and Hashem, every sin is a kind of promiscuity. It's a kind of unfaithfulness. But in its most extreme version, it's idol worship. It's to worship another god. On its less extreme version, as we've been studying in those who are studying the Daily Tanya the last week or so, how the essence of idol worship isn't necessarily to declare I am a God, but even the notion of independence, because the truth is God's the only truth. And when a person declares I am for myself, I'm independent, that in and of itself is a kind of idol worship at its seminal state. And in the Alter Rebbe's language, Ikev Shorish, it's the root of idol worship, is the idea that I am an independent being, as opposed to recognizing the truth that Hashem is the only independent reality. And therefore, all ego, in that sense, is an idol worship, is a promiscuity, is a unfaithfulness with Hashem. In that sense, the Alter Tanya points out that anger is a similar thing. Because when a person gets angry about an event, the reason to get angry is because the person momentarily forgot that the only reality is Hashem. If I were to recognize that the only reality is God, and that this happened because this is the way God sees it to be right, then what am I angry for? So the moment of anger shares this commonality with infidelity with Hashem, in that in the moment of anger, I've declared an independence from Hashem. Hashem did this action, but I'm angry about it. So there's a connection there between the anger and promiscuity in our relationship with Hashem. And I'll just put a final comment there, because it's a difficult thing, right? Never getting angry, always being conscious that Hashem is the only reality. So first of all, I mean, obviously this is our work in this world, to try to remember this, that Hashem is the only truth and everything is in His hands, and we should not be so worried and anxious and angry about the world. That's the avodah, that's the big work. But I'll just share an episode that Rabbi Yoel Khan, the famous mashpia and teacher of Hasidus, relates. That of two friends, one is a chassid and one is not. And they're talking, and the one who's a chassid is talking about the oneness of God as described in Chassidus, how God's the only reality and so on. In great detail and great deep philosophy, Chassidus describes this. So the friend who doesn't learn Chassidus tells the friend that does, says, look, you can talk from today to tomorrow about how God's the only reality, but I'm your friend. I've seen you get angry. So what do you mean God's the only reality? You know, you talk about it in the theory, but I saw you get angry. So the friend who is a chassid said, you're right. I did. See, but here's what happens when you spend time studying the truth that Hashem is the only reality. What happens the day after you get angry? The next day, when you reflect on your anger? One reflection might be to reimagine the offense the person gave you and then get angrier. You think about what happened and how terrible it was, how right you were to get angry, and you start getting angry even more. That's one way to rethink about it. Another way to rethink about it is, and this is the way a chassid would rethink about the moment he was angry. He would think about his yesterday and look at himself and say, how could you have gotten angry? Didn't you learn that Hashem is the only reality? So why did you get angry yesterday? So it's true that in the moment, it's very difficult to not have that kind of reaction. And we should try our best to train ourselves to see that Hashem is the only truth and not get angry and not react that way. But even if we slip, our thoughts about it the next day are such that that was unbecoming. It was unbecoming of me to be angry like that. It changes the way you think about your past anger, your past anxiety, as it were. You look back and say, why was I worried about this? Hashem runs the world. So even that, the post problem avodah itself has value, not just in the moment. Okay, so that's what I want to comment on regard to the previous Gemara. Now we can go forward. Of course, if anybody has any comments, you're welcome to share. Okay, so we are right over here. You can see the highlighted text there. The Gemara now returns to the discussion on how many witnesses are required for the various different events in the law of the Sotah, right? And there were three events. There's the event of the warning. And when it came to the warning, there was the dispute in our Mishnah, whether we need, not in our Mishnah, that was a dispute in the Braita that the Gemara quoted. One view was that requires two witnesses, and the other was that it only requires one witness, or the husband himself can say, I warned her. The second event is the moment they are secluded, this woman and the other man. That moment requires two witnesses in accordance, also dispute, but this dispute was in our Mishnah, whether that requires two witnesses or not. And in the third event, everybody agrees only one witness, namely the event that undoes the Sotah. If someone were to come and testify that I've seen that they were engaged physically, and that would undo the law of the Sotah. That's where that's the background, the framework for this following piece. So Gemara says, Tanan Hasam. We were taught there in the Mishnaic H text. Shahaya B'din, it would have been appropriate by law that the first event following the view that requires two witnesses, namely, actually this event is the second event in what we just described. The first event in this context is the second event we just described. Just like when it comes to the first event, namely their seclusion. Does not make him and her forbidden forever. Right? The moment this woman is secluded with the other man, then this woman is no longer, and there's two witnesses to testify to that event, following that view. Then in that moment, she is no longer allowed to be intimate with her husband. But that doesn't happen, that doesn't last forever. She goes to drink the water of the Sotah, and once the water of the Sotah clarifies that she was faithful, she didn't engage physically, then she's allowed to be back with her husband. So the separation caused by the two witnesses who say that the husband and that this woman and the other man were secluded only separates husband and wife temporarily. And yet, it does not get established by pachas mishnayim unless you have two. And according to this view, you have to have two witnesses for that moment, that for this event, of the two of them be secluded. So even though it only makes husband and wife separate temporarily until she drinks the water of the Sotah, yet we require two witnesses. So it does not get established, this event of the two of them being secluded, which makes them separate temporarily, requires two witnesses. If that's the case, the last event, which cancels the law of the Sotah, if there are witnesses which tell us that this woman and the other man were physically engaged, and thus the law of the Sotah is canceled, but now husband and wife can never get back together again. They have to divorce, and they can't remarry. It's done, it's over. Which makes her forbidden to her husband forever. Is it then not logical that it should also require two witnesses? So if the event of their seclusion, which only separates husband and wife temporarily, requires two witnesses, how the more so the event of their actual being intimate, which cancels the law of the Sotah, but then makes them be separated forever, how much more so it should require two witnesses. So that would have been the logic had there not been a verse to explicitly state that the moment of intimacy only requires one witness. So Talmud Leimar, therefore the verse comes and tells us, this is the verse we quoted earlier, the Eid Einba. There was no testimony, meaning to say there was no two witnesses, but Kol Sheyeshba, there was one witness.
Sorry, this is for the seclusion part?
This is the moment of intimacy, right? That's the verse we quoted earlier, that the verse explicitly states that the moment of intimacy gets the exemption and only requires one witness, right? So had the verse not made this exemption explicit, I would have concluded you need two witnesses, because the event which makes them, the event of their secluding, which makes her separate from her husband temporarily until the water of the Sotah verifies. If that moment requires two witnesses, just to make them separate temporarily, how the more so the moment of intimacy, which makes them separate forever and also cancels the law of the Sotah, requires two witnesses. But because the verse explicitly states at the moment of their intimacy gets this exemption, therefore our logical conclusion is off, because the verse says otherwise. Okay. Now, says the Gemara, one second, now let's go to the reverse. Now, now, since the verse just told us that there's an exemption for the moment of their intimacy, and that even though one person is coming to tell us, we saw the two of them be intimate, yet on the word of this one person, we make this husband and wife separate forever, then make the calculation back to the other way. If the permanent separation of husband and wife can be verified by one witness as per the verse's exemption, and how the more so, the temporary separation between husband and wife, which comes as the result of their seclusion, should also only require one witness. In other words, first we went with the logic to make the moment of intimacy have two witnesses. But since the Torah exempted us and said the moment of intimacy only requires one, now let's use that logic to say the moment of seclusion also only requires one. As the Gemara puts it. Now, if the moment of their intimacy, which is a result of that intimacy, husband and wife can never be together again. The Torah gave us the exemption and allows that event to be certified, to be upheld by one witness. Then the first time when they were secluded, which does not make their separation permanent, it's only until she drinks the waters. Is it therefore not logical that one witness is enough there? In other words, let's look at the stronger of the two cases. The stronger of the two issues is the moment of intimacy. It's the most harsh piece of information. They were intimate, and that causes them, husband and wife, to be separated. Done, they're over, because she was intimate with the other person. If the Torah lowers the bar over there and says you only need one witness, and how much more so the first event, which isn't such a harsh event, they were just secluded. How much more so that should only be one witness? Because all that moment does is make them separate temporarily. And therefore, Talmud Sotah comes the verse and teaches us, Ki motza ba ervas davar. With respect to, where is that Rashi? Yeah, with a woman who is misbehaving, the Torah says if you find a matter of impropriety, this word matter, davar, is compared to a different verse. Elsewhere it says, the matter shall be settled or should be upheld based on 2 or 3 witnesses. So this word davar, this word the matter, implies that any matter must have 2 witnesses. So ma davar edim, just like the davar, the matter in the verse describing witnesses, testimony, requires 2. Afkan, so to here with a woman's impropriety, where the Torah uses the word matter, davar, a matter, al pishnayim, you need to have 2. Okay. In other words, like this. What the Gemara is telling us is as follows. Don't try to rationalize your way and say, because one of the 2 cases require 1, therefore the other. Or because one of these cases require 2, then the other also requires 2. Right? First, we tried to say that because the moment of seclusion requires 2, therefore the moment of intimacy should also require 2. But the verse explicitly gives us the exemption for the moment of intimacy. Then the Gemara tried to go the other way. Well, the moment of intimacy only has an exemption and only requires 1 witness, then so should the moment of seclusion. Says the Gemara, no, each of these 2 moments have a verse to tell them that the law applies exactly as is. The moment of intimacy has a verse which tells you an exemption that it does not require full testimony and 1 witness is enough. And the moment of seclusion has this word, a matter, and the word a matter implies 2 witnesses. As per elsewhere in the Torah says the matter must be upheld by 2 witnesses. Hope that's clear. In other words, there's a verse to tell us that the moment of seclusion requires 2, and there's a verse to tell us that the moment of intimacy requires 1. And don't try to use logic to say that the law should apply to each other. Because the Torah makes explicit or implicit laws regarding each of those moments. That the moment of intimacy is exempt and only requires 1 witness. And the moment of seclusion requires 2 witnesses, considering that the verse says, davar, a matter. And the word a matter, the word davar, is used elsewhere in the context of telling us you need to have 2 witnesses. And therefore they each get their own law without being able to teach each other. Because of the person. Sorry,
I didn't mean to interrupt at that point, but it's interesting that that's being mentioned now in the Gemara, because earlier in the chain of this argument, it wasn't mentioned that there were clear verses to distinguish one event from another.
Yeah,
it was argued that there was either 2 or 1. So why
Yes.
is it being brought up now that it's clear that there's verses that tell us how many witnesses there should be for each event?
The Gemara is going to ask that very question right now. Because this is the end of the Mishnaic text. Now the Gemara is going to ask, didn't you rationalize it earlier already? That's what the Gemara is going to ask right now. As the Gemara says here, Hi michi motza ba'evras davar nafka. The fact that you need two witnesses for the moment of intimacy, for the moment of seclusion, comes from the verse that says a matter. Miba nafka. We already derived it earlier from the fact that the Torah says, in this event, the event of intimacy, you have an exemption, but in this event of intimacy, you have the exemption, but not at the moment of warning. In this event of intimacy, you have the exemption of one witness, but not the moment of seclusion. This is what you're referencing, Robert. The Gemara already told us that the exemption is exclusive. And the question was exclusive to one or exclusive to two, but we've already established that the very fact that the Torah gives you an exemption, that you only need one witness for the moment of intimacy, the Torah already said that that's an exclusive exemption and don't apply it elsewhere. So why do I have to have this fact that the Torah says davar and a matter means two witnesses? Leave it as is. Universally, you need two witnesses, and one event gets the exemption because the Torah says, but in this moment, you have the exemption, and that's it. Why do you have to have an extra verse to tell us that because it says the word matter and matter means two witnesses? Just leave it as a part of the universal law. You always need two witnesses. That's your question?
I think so.
But is it clear? I hope it's clear. If it's not clear, please interrupt me.
Yeah, I think so.
Just to recap, the Gemara earlier told us that the reason why you need two witnesses by the event, let's just go with the opinion that says you need two witnesses both for the seclusion and you need two witnesses for the warning. Let's just go with that opinion. The Gemara earlier said the reason why you need those two witnesses for seclusion and two witnesses for warning is because that's the universal rule of all of Torah. You need two witnesses. Now, the fact that you don't need two witnesses by the moment of intimacy, that's the exception to the rule. Because the Pasuk said, in this moment, you have an exemption. So why would I start reasoning that I'm allowed to use it, that I'm allowed to use the exemption elsewhere? And the text we read this morning sounds as if logically, you would extend the exemption to the moment of seclusion. I just happen to have a verse which says the word matter, and the word matter tells me that you need to have two. Why do I have to go that far? Universally, all events need two witnesses, with the exception of one case where the Torah says, in this case, you have an exemption.
Rabbi, from the 13 principles of interpretation by Rabbi Ishmael, so the exception here makes it such because of the words that are used, that in fact, here's the general rule, but here's the exception based on the a rule of interpretation with regard to legislation that we have, of course, in our Siddur, and that describes it.
Correct.
Right. Thank you.
Yes, you cannot expand the exemption larger than what the Torah allows you. Torah gave an exemption for one case. That's it. Finished. That's the way we understood it till now. But now all of a sudden we're saying you have to have a special verse to tell you that no, you need two witnesses at the moment of seclusion. You don't need that. That's just the universal rule.
What may help, Rabbi, is to at one point perhaps to go through the 13 rules of interpretation.
Interesting. Somebody else asked that recently also.
So, maybe to go through the 13 rules of interpretation and demonstrate how the logic of those rules of interpretation basically allow us to paskin in a way that allows us to see the differentiations and the subtle differences with the distinctions that demarcate.
Yeah, somebody else recently also asked me to do that. Maybe one day
when you have a chance.
It's a lot of work. Maybe one day we'll do it because it's very difficult because there's different opinions about the 13 principles also.
Also, there are.
There's 24. There's Bryson with 24 principles. It's not as easy as it.
But perhaps it would assist in just knowing that here are the various opinions with regard to how to paskin.
Yeah. Perhaps we'll do that.
Thank you.
Maybe just as a suggestion, if one of those 13 are being applied in any particular piece that we're learning, be highlighted and maybe explored a little bit.
Okay, that's an idea. It's an idea. Okay, so let's do the Gemara's concluding lines here on this comment to answer this question: why we need the specific verse to tell us davar, a matter. Says the Gemara, Hachanami ka'amar. You have to indeed read that into this Mishnaic text we quoted as follows. Talmud Loimar, the fact that we don't have the exemption for the moment of seclusion is because of the word ba. Because the Torah says when the Torah gives us the exemption for the moment of intimacy, the Torah says in this moment you get the exemption. Bavole bekinui, in this moment you get the exemption. Bavole bestira, in this moment you get the exemption, and not during seclusion and not during warning. Because the Torah gave you only one exemption. Only the moment of intimacy gets the exemption. Now, considering such, Toma ba'alma, in general, when a woman behaves improperly, beloy kinui, without warning, ubeloy stira, without seclusion. In other words, irrespective of the law of the Sotah, just generally speaking, if a woman misbehaves, the fact that you don't believe one witness, how do you know this? This is because of the universal rule. And where's the universal rule derived? The universal rule is derived. The Torah describes and says when you find matter of impropriety, the pasuk says that the matter is to be established by two or three, and therefore just like when the Torah describes witness, it says a matter requires two witnesses, so two witnesses. In other words, like this. The Gemara is reading our question into the very Mishnaic text. Now, when it comes to the law of the Sotah, the Torah is explicit. Only one exemption just for the moment of intimacy. Now, as for mispropriety in other cases where you don't have warning, you don't have seclusion, you don't have this whole half Sotah story, how do you know there you need two witnesses? Well, that's because of the universal rule. Where does the universal rule come from? From the word davar, from the word matter. Because the pasuk says a matter must be derived with two witnesses. And thus the Gemara kind of reads our question into the Mishnaic text. Now, this is not an uncommon thing because, as I mentioned, the Mishnaic texts are really a collection of notes, right? It's people who are sitting in class, listening to their teachers and writing notes down. So Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi collected these notes and made the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is edited precisely to the liking of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. But when it comes to Mishnaic age texts that didn't make it to the final cut of the Mishnah, you have much more wiggle room to say, look, the person was taking notes and did it shorthand, but he missed out a few details. And therefore the Gemara will say, if the shorthand notes don't match up with what we know, we can say the person was taking quick notes and we have to add a few details in. And that's what the Gemara is doing here. The Gemara is reading our question into the Mishnaic text and saying that the Mishnaic text really means both. It means to say that the exemption of allowing one witness is exclusively for the moment of intimacy, as we described earlier, but the pasuk says, in it you have the exemption, but not for the moment of seclusion, where you don't have the exemption, and not for the moment of warning, where you also don't have the exemption, and they require two witnesses. Now, as for the universal rule that whenever a woman misbehaves, you need two witnesses, go look at the word that the pasuk says, a matter. The pasuk says a matter comes as a result of two witnesses. And thus we're kind of reading our question into the very Mishnaic text. Okay, I hope that was somewhat clear. We'll stop over here, and God willing, we continue our exploration of these laws tomorrow.
Rabbi, I think you gave an excellent summary because you gave an expansion of the 10th interpretation, which is whatever is first implied in a general law and afterwards specified to add another provision, which is not similar to the general law, is specified in order to alleviate in some respects, and in others, so in some ways to make it less severe, but in others, as you put it so well, and you went through all the possibilities, in others to increase the severity of that particular provision.
Right. So that's an interesting rule. It's the Gemara is kind of trying to circumvent a little bit of that, because that rule sometimes tells you that if there's a detail changed in the general law, it might either weaken the general law or strengthen the general law, right? So over here, the exemption is held to a specific space because of the word ba in it, as the exemption should not weaken the rest of the law.
Yes.
Right.
Excellent.
Okay, have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you so much. It makes it so clear with regard to the element of how every word, it's such a silly term in English. The devil is in the details. No, the angel is in the details. It's every word counts here. And so I really very appreciated. Thank you very much, Rabbi. God bless you all. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. You too.
Take care.
Have a good day.
God bless.